This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of The Biggest Table, I talk with David Swanson, pastor of New Community Covenant Church and author of the new book, Plundered. We discuss the interconnections between racial and environmental injustice, the impact of politics, and the role of faith and community in addressing these issues. Swanson shares the importance of understanding community history, embracing diversity in worship, and practical measures for communal and individual transformation. Additionally, he explains the significance of Sabbath, belonging, and virtue in fostering justice and reconciliation, emphasizing the power of the table in facilitating these transformations. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by David Swanson. David is the founding pastor of New Community Covenant Church who lives with his family on the south side of Chicago. He is the founder and CEO of New Community Outreach, a nonprofit organization dedicated to healing community trauma through restorative practices. David is the author of Rediscipling the White Church, From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity, and Plundered, The Tangled Roots of Racial and Environmental Injustice. He is a former director of church planting for the Evangelical Covenant Church, and on most Tuesday mornings, you'll find him wandering around Jackson Park looking for birds. So thanks for joining me today, David. It's great to connect and really enjoyed both of your books.
You're welcome, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
So I went here and we talked a little bit about it before we started recording, but you pastor a multi-ethnic church. We're recording this less than a week after the presidential election. And because, we are talking about racial and environmental injustice, I'm curious for our listeners who probably are predominantly white, how's your community handling the past week, all the election build up and the aftermath, and how are you all doing in this space?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Just by way of maybe some background, the neighborhood where our church is located is called Bronzeville, which for folks who don't know Chicago, I say it's sort of the Harlem of Chicago. Same kind of historical trajectory and cultural significance. So still a majority African American community. Our church is about a third African American, a third Asian American, third white, and then a handful of Latino folks and some other, more recent immigrants. So kind of all over the place. I think for the most part, the congregation took pretty seriously the rhetoric and policy proposals of the now president-elect, and generally didn't hear those as good news or hopeful, right, in any kind of livable way. But also, and this is, I think, the real gift of our congregation and its community, many of our folks carry a long memory of moments like this, where the nation's politics very clearly and obviously don't have their best interest in mind. And that's a terrible thing, but it's also a legacy for many folks of God's faithfulness, this real sense that our hope is not in any nation or any government, that democracy in this country has, for the most part, not really been democratic for everyone, hasn't really represented everyone. And so there's a lot of heartbreak for sure. Not so much a partisan heartbreak, but more of I think a pretty clear-eyed understanding of some of the repercussions. And there is also this genuine desire to continue to worship, to very publicly and visibly say, we've always known where our hope is. We know the foundation that we have in a Savior who has never been beholden to a a nation that has so purposefully excluded so many people in its government and representative process. So I find myself so thankful to be able to be in a community like this at a time like this. I feel as though my personal experience has been so shaped by the community that I'm a part of. I would probably be trending toward despair potentially otherwise, and I'm just not, right? I'd have too many of these other voices in my ear right now reminding me that our faith is not a theoretical thing. It's not an abstract thing. It has been the thing that has allowed people to endure just terrible injustice and suffering and so on. So I think it'll be interesting in the days and weeks to come to see how we continue to process this. But as of yesterday, at least this past Sunday, I feel so thankful for belonging to this community.
That's awesome. And you mentioned, yeah, like that you have these different voices that are encouraging you towards hope and solidarity. And so, um, as we continue to explore this, like how did you as a white male get so, your heart beat so turned towards
Mhm.
racial injustice, towards environmental injustice? Like
Mhm.
what led you down this path, just for our listeners to understand?
Yeah, I think that I grew up in a family that was deeply rooted in our Christian faith and didn't understand that to be incompatible with a concern for equality, justice, compassion, and so on. I'm a missionary kid, and so I grew up in
Hmm.
Venezuela and Ecuador, and so kind of lived and breathed that cross cultural reality, and certainly that was really formational for me. Um, as I've gotten older, I've thought back to the years when our family moved back to the United States to Southern California, and these were the Rodney King years, the O.J. Simpson years. In California, there was legislation proposed that would have kept the children of undocumented immigrants from attending public schools. And that was, those were my high school years of kind of breathing that air and kind of making these observations and trying to figure out this country that was mine, but that I hadn't had a lot of experience with. Um, I don't think there was ever a singular moment of kind of waking up, right? I think it was
Hmm.
more just this environment of faith intersecting with these kind of complicated realities that I could observe, but that didn't necessarily impact me in the same kind of way. So fast forwarding ahead, when my wife and I moved to the Chicago area and started to get to know Chicago and made some dear friends who introduced us to not just the downtown part of the city, but more of the city, and kind of started on a learning journey about how this city has been shaped by race and systemic racism. Um, but again, always from the perspective of, well, yeah, of course Jesus cares about all of this. Like, of course, this is all central to who Jesus is and to what Jesus is doing in the world. None of this is separate from, um, from the God who we worship, from the God we read about in Scripture, and so on. So I've certainly had lots of moments of growth and kind of my eyes
Yeah.
being opened to learning to understand how these things are connected, say racism and environmental injustice and so on. But it's always been from this place that, well, this is what Christians do. Uh,
Hmm.
this is God's world. We're God's people, and so of course this is what Christians do. We lean into these places where there's this gap between God's will and what we're actually experiencing on this earth. Um, and I've been helped in so many ways by dear friends whose experiences
Hmm.
have just been very very different than mine, who've been very gracious to invite me into their lives to
Hmm.
share some of their stories, invite me to participate in the good work that they're doing in our community, and so on. So still got a long ways to go, still got tons and tons to learn, obviously.
Right.
Um, but the gift of all of this for me has been that my faith has never
Hmm.
had to be separate from these concerns about justice. And I know that's not the case for everybody.
No, no. As you were talking, I was like, wow, like what a gift! Just because
Yeah.
so many of us, I feel like myself included, we're having to relearn
Mm-hmm.
some patterns that, for good or for bad, the white evangelical church has neglected. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so what a gift that your faith has always seen, and been lived out in these margins.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I've loved about your book, and as I read it, you you're not talking from the abstract. You're living
Mm-hmm.
it. Your community's practicing what you're talking about in your book. And so, like, how has that journey unfolded for you as your community? Because I think it's easy to talk about these ideas. It's harder to
Mm.
actually, practice the interdependence, the
Mhm,
solidarity, the
mhm,
sacramental
mhm,
nature.
mhm,
Um, so, like, what has that looked like for your community? Uh,
mhm. Yeah, I think in many ways I couldn't have written, well, either of these books, but certainly the most recent one, Plundered, without being really rooted in a particular place and in this particular worshiping community, because I needed their help to make some of these connections. So just to rewind a little bit, back in high school, I started doing backpacking trips in the Sierra Nevada mountains
mm,
and just found this deep love for creation, for nature. In college, I was an outdoor education major and I did a 3 month internship in Bolivia, helping basically just assisting the Bolivian churches do
mm,
wilderness and camping ministry. And I thought, this is it. This is what I want to do. Love being outdoors, love God's creation. And then in graduate school, really was redirected to the local church in a way that was
mm,
not expected, was very surprising to me. And then a few years later, towards more the urban multiracial context. And so for a good decade, I was just learning everything I could about race, racism, white supremacy, so on, trying to make these connections theologically. And as I'm doing that, there's always this little uh, kind of question in the back of my mind. Well, how does this connect with these other areas of passion, right? So maybe similar to your podcast, food and faith, and like how
right.
do these things, right? You kind of know they go together, but like how does this actually work? And my wife would sometimes joke like, man, I married a guy who was like a hippie and just wanted to be outside all the time, and now we're in this urban context doing urban ministry. And so being rooted in our particular church has been this gift of being able to explore some of these connections, so that, as for example, our church's nonprofit takes over this community garden at the request of a local school and starts spending time there and nurturing this ground into really flourishing and fresh produce and vegetables that we get to share with our neighbors and community. And I'm watching this intersection of what I would call, racial reconciliation and people's enjoyment for God's creation and providing fresh produce and helping people understand, myself included, where does this food actually come from, if not from a shelf in a grocery store. Um, that that lived community experience has allowed me to recognize some connections I just don't think I would have made otherwise. And I think it's the particularity of our places that opens up the kind of creative pursuit of God's justice that otherwise escapes a lot of us. And maybe we'll get into this, but it's the distance from our places. It's
Yeah.
living at a remove from our places, kind of this industrialized gap between God's actual creation and where we live our lives, that keeps many of us, myself included, from seeing the potential of joining God in the actual place where we live. And
Mm.
that's one of the invitations I hope in this book, is to push through some of that to a more tender relationship with God's creation.
No, and I definitely see that. So yeah, let's step back a little, because I think where we are in this cultural moment, these, you talk about the Anthropocene age that we're in. You talk about the extractive nature, of both racial injustice and, I think, the globalized agricultural
Hmm. Hmm.
moment. So can you explain sort of some of these bigger ideas? Because I do think they help people understand, why, this move towards solidarity, this move towards localized
Mm.
place
Mm.
needs to happen.
Yeah, so this was some of the digging that I needed to do in this. I understood and could articulate that the environmental destruction that is so common in our world has underneath it, to some extent, greed, taking more, taking more, taking more at the expense of the creation itself. And we can think of examples of this, of blowing the tops off of mountains in Appalachia, or abusing communities in different countries in Africa to dig for the components that go into our cell phones, the kind of monocrop farming in my own state here in Illinois. As we drive to our in-laws down in Tennessee, it's just the fields just look completely the same, and
Mm.
treated with pesticides and so on. And it was somewhat easy to say, yeah, there is some level of greed behind this. Of just, we need to take more, we need to take more. It took me a little longer to see that connection with race, because the story we tell about race is that because people are racist, they take advantage of people. And that telling is backward, historically, at least. Historically, before there's ever something we would call racism or even race, there are groups of people taking advantage, using other groups of people. Before there's anything like whiteness, you have European colonialists and settlers taking indigenous land, enslaving people from Africa, kidnapping them, bringing them to North America. And then over time, a justification has to be developed of why is this okay, particularly as Christian people. Why is this okay, right? And this is where the story of race begins to evolve, and it shape shifts over time. But now we can say that it's okay to do this because we have a justifying story. These people are less than, they're not fully human. They didn't develop the land, so on and so forth. Just, terribly evil and deceptive stories, but nonetheless, justification for. So telling that story correctly, for me, shows that the same greed that's underneath environmental destruction is actually beneath systemic racism as well. They share the same impulse. So if that's the case, if greed is underneath this, and then it's kind of manifestation of theft, you start to then look at our global economy and recognize that it's extraction and exploitation that we see really organizing our world. That the way that we treat the land, that we treat other people, is often through these assumptions of an extractive economy or an exploitative culture, where this place is for enriching me. It's for what I can take from it. Similarly, though we wouldn't say it so bluntly, this group of people can be consigned to a proximity to toxic waste, or to a flood zone, or whatever the case, because somehow their lives are not as inherently valuable as is my white life. So for me, being able to look at our world and see the power of these sins of exploitation and extraction, it's really sobering. It's a really terrible thing to have to reckon with. But I think it's necessary to say, here's where we actually are. This is where we actually live today. And to pretend otherwise is to diminish what we're actually up against. And as a Christian, it is to diminish the extent of our sin. And so it's to diminish the possibility of genuine repentance, confession, and genuine reconciliation, and the pursuit of justice. So it's a terrible thing to have to acknowledge. I think it's a necessary thing, and I think the only way that any way forward opens up is if we're willing to really tell the truth.
So much you said there. There's a lot, and but it's so helpful. And so, like, we have these mindset that we're in, and I think it's shaped, I think me more than I want to care to admit of this,
Mhm,
the world is mine for the taking.
mhm, mhm,
Um, like, what world is, like, it feels something, and I've heard somebody else talk about it, that, maybe we're not in an Anthropocene age, but like this capital scene age, where,
mhm,
like,
mhm,
capitalism, I
mhm,
don't want to say
mhm,
capitalism is bad in and of itself, but like this unfettered capitalism we see in
mhm.
America, like, has is there any way out? Like, you know, we're so
Right.
rooted or so shaped by
That's
these
right.
principles. Like,
That's right.
you know, unless we tear down the whole system, is like,
Hmm.
is there a
Hmm.
way out, or like what?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like,
I mean, the way you're asking that question, even like the tone in your voice, like I'm like, oh, I know that, I know that question, I know that
yeah.
the feeling kind of underneath that question. Um, so in the work for this book, I recognize sort of two main approaches um, to trying to actually move forward, right? To acknowledge what we're up against, to acknowledge the extent of the damage, both in the arena of race, but also the environment. And one of those is very personal, individual. It is, we individuals need a change of heart because we have been so deeply formed by an exploitative, extractive culture. We've come to see others in this way, see the creation this way. So we need individually a change of heart. And I say yes and amen to that. The other is we need a systemic change,
Mm-hmm.
that these are systemic realities uh, having to do with a consumer capitalistic economy where we pay more attention to the growth of stocks, regardless of what is behind that or what is underneath that and what the damage is. This is how we measure the economy and the economy's growth. Um, and so we need a systemic change. We need to approach this in a way that trades a system of exploitation to a system that's genuinely good for the flourishing of everyone. And I say yes and amen to that. And then I also say, and I'm a pastor.
Right.
Yes, so my concern as a pastor is different than either of those. It includes both of those, and I want to affirm both of those, and also say that as the people of God, called to very particular local communities, we have our specific role to play, which has to do with our local uh, um, material place and reality,
Hmm.
so that it's not solely individual and it's not massively systemic. It's more communal. Is what
Mm-hmm.
my focus is in this book. Now that includes the individual because, as we know, to follow Jesus includes a complete transformation. It includes the systemic in that as communities get to know and love their places, they find solidarity with others who are doing similar stuff. And so we are addressing the systems that are doing so much damage. But I think as Christians, it's important to remember that we do belong to this particular people, that we are called to this particular place, and that there is actually an invitation for us to live out what I call our priestly caretaking vocation together in a way that transforms us. It makes us into a reconciled people such that systemic racism is undermined. And it introduces a relational harmony with our places such that our presence is no longer a burden to our place, but is a blessing to our place. So that's where I feel really hopeful. I don't think we can
Mm-hmm.
do this on our own. As much as I think systemic change is necessary, that's not where most of us live most of our lives. And so it can
Yeah.
feel a little bit overwhelming. But I think inviting us into the good work of being the people of God in a relationship with our place opens up a lot of creative possibility.
No, I love that. I love that idea that, you know, being rooted and grounded in a particular place as as a Christian community. Um, and I'm curious, you know, because I do see the hope, and I do think, you know, despite the pain many of us have experienced from the church, myself included,
Yes.
I still have
Yes.
hope in the church. Um, but for listeners who are maybe beginning this journey and don't see how they've been impacted by
Mm,
race, by the destructive practices of race and these
mm,
destructive environmental practices, how can they then begin to walk around with eyes open to their community?
mm.
Like, is there a way to begin? Because we need to first feel it, right? To repent of it and to
Yes,
bring
that's
forth
right.
something new. So
That's right.
how do people maybe who are, you know, in a white evangelical church
Hmm. Hmm.
may not see it all the time, like how can we begin to walk around with eyes open in our communities, to see how we've been shaped by these
Mm.
practices when it may not feel it on a
Mhm,
daily
mhm,
basis.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's an important question because it gets at one of the characteristics of an extractive economy is that it insulates some of us from its worst
Mm,
tendencies and impacts, even as those tendencies and impacts are very visible to those who live in those places of extraction and exploitation. There's a theologian, uh, Daniel Castillo, and
mm,
he writes about zones of extraction. So these are the mountaintops being blown off, right? These are the largely black and brown communities living near toxic waste sites, being exposed to cancer at much higher rates than others. These are the zones of extraction. And you can trace this way, way back to kind of how European colonists tied to ecclesial structures claimed portions of the New World to enrich their countries, right? Zones
yeah.
of extraction. But then there's also zones of accumulation, he says, right? So what's
Mm,
extracted from these places, from these people, gets transferred to others. And so the insulation that you're describing for some of us is evidence that we live closer to the zone of accumulation than of
right.
extraction,
Mm,
right? That our lifestyle, that our ability to be relatively ignorant of the power of race betrays where we live and how we've been insulated. So I think that's the first thing is just to acknowledge that that's not accidental, that there's intent and purpose behind how our world has been organized. But then here's the great gift of the church, capital C. We have sisters and brothers who do live in those zones of extraction, who can bear witness to it, who can describe with a lot of accuracy what it has looked like to live on the other side of our systematized sins of greed and theft. And so while relational reconciliation is not necessarily the goal, it is a kind of ecosystem of justice and solidarity because now we're in relationship with those whose experiences have been very different than ours, even as they worship the same Lord. And these witnesses change then how we see our own environment. So to think about a white Christian who lives in a majority white space, starting to be in relationship with people who live in different places will cause me to evaluate my surroundings a little bit
mm,
differently. I'll start to ask questions about, well, why is it that it's mostly white people who live in this area? How did that come about? Why is it that my public school seems to be so much better funded than a public school that's in a more of an urban area or where the property taxes aren't quite as high, or so on and so forth? Why is it that I don't have to worry about living near contaminated drinking water when a whole bunch of other people do need to worry about this? And so just asking those questions
mm,
coming out of this kind of these diverse relationships within the body of Christ starts to crack some stuff open for us. And what we had originally assumed to just be the way the world is, the kind of normal and neutral, we start to realize, well, there's nothing natural about this at all,
no.
actually, right? It was imposed for particular purposes. And now we start to hear Paul's voice in our ear saying, we don't conform to these patterns,
Mm,
these worldly patterns that just seem to be the way the world works. We don't conform to them. We actually cut against those things. So those patterns are generally not going to be the real dramatic stuff. It's going to be just the subtle things that kind of work their way into our way of life. We realize actually this stuff isn't neutral. And as a follower of Jesus, I'm going to have to choose another way.
mm. No, and it's that living in that already not yet tension that you're already,
Yeah,
you voiced so well this time of
that's good.
like, yes, we need to recognize and own the stories of brokenness and the
Mhm.
systemic problems, but also hope and, that there is redemption coming. Uh,
Mm,
and
yeah,
I love how you remain so hopeful. Like, I think, for so many of us, it's easy to despair or just get like
yeah.
nothing's ever going to change. Um, but you've adopted practices that lead your community, lead yourself into places of hope. And so, like,
Mhm,
as
mhm,
somebody who's listening to this and they're like, okay, I recognize it, I'm seeing stuff, like, I can't affect governmental change. I probably can't even affect ecclesial changes. Like,
mhm, mhm,
like,
mhm.
but I
Right.
am an individual connected to a group of people. Like,
Yeah,
I can do something, right? And,
that's right.
it's taking that first step. And so what are these practices that you've found most helpful and hopeful? And where would you encourage listeners to start, both individually and then, as maybe as a small group?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I appreciate the fact that so many of us uh, don't necessarily feel a sense of agency as it relates to changing the things we're a part of. We can see what's wrong. We can see how even our local congregations often live out of step or live far too in step with the patterns of this
Right.
world, right? Than the kind of community life that we long for. So that is a true and really difficult thing and painful thing to acknowledge, and yet it is the case for many of us. Um, I think there is something about Jesus's invitation to new wineskins that we need to pay attention to in this season.
Mm-hmm.
I think we are in a kind of apocalyptic moment right now, and we don't have to pretend to know how that ends. But apocalypse is revealing, right? It's a
Yeah.
revealing of what's true. Now that truth is the terrible stuff, right? That
Yeah.
had been covered up, and we're seeing that. But the truth is also about God too, right? It's the oh no, God is actually very present in exile. God
Mm-hmm.
is not a long ways off. You don't have to go back to the good old days to find God. God is actually in exile, welcoming you home, even
Mm-hmm.
in exile. This is apocalypse, I think. And so, for those who find themselves in that place, recognizing that one, God is in this place with me. This is just the story of our scriptures: is that God is a God of exile,
Mm-hmm.
and then hearing Jesus' invitation to new wineskins. So that will look a whole lot of different ways for different people. I don't want to be prescriptive about that, but I'm pretty convinced that there's always a handful of other folks who are being called to the new wineskins as
Right.
well. I think this is what God does, right? He doesn't leave us in isolation. So,
No.
Lord, give us eyes of faith to see those other women and men in my community who I can link up with, and then yeah. So then, how are we becoming the kinds of people who actually want this other way of life? Because an extractive, exploitative economy has done a number on our desires and our
Mm.
loves. Our heads may say we want something different. Uh, but at the end of the day, where are we spending our time? Where are we spending our money? What do our
Mm.
priorities reveal? And so we just have to acknowledge that as emotional creatures, our loves and desires and wants have been misformed in some
Yeah.
really deep ways. So what then does it look like for community to grow into some new and some better loves and desires that will actually be a blessing to our local places? The three that I talk about in this book are these practices of belonging, of keeping Sabbath, and then of virtue. And without going deep into these, I do think there's this need to become people who belong.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're familiar with language of belonging, of like I want to belong somewhere. I'm thinking particularly about a people learning to belong to their place.
Hmm.
Like, here's a people who can only really be understood in relationship to their place. If you were to
Hmm.
move them somewhere else, they wouldn't make total sense because they have such an affectionate relationship with their place that it's actually begun to shape them in a really deep way. And then with Sabbath, I've just come to believe that Sabbath, as we find it in Scripture, is a paradigm for a deeply human life. That Sabbath, far less than being a once a week practice, becomes a way of reorienting our entire lives around gift and grace, rather than around greed and theft.
Yeah.
And then finally, virtue is a deeply a kind of Christian understanding of what it means to become the people God has created
Yeah.
us to be. And so I just take the seven classical virtues and try to apply them to becoming priestly caretakers in our place and say, it's not just that we're called to fix a problem out there. That'll wear you out. That'll
Yeah.
run you over, right? But God's vision is so good and it's so comprehensive that it includes our own transformation in the really deep places as well. And so we don't leave ourselves out of this picture of transformation.
No, no. And as you were talking about the practices, and I was reading it, what I appreciated is that, these practices were both individual and communal, that like
Yeah. Yeah.
Sabbath, sometimes we see Sabbath or want to practice Sabbath as pulling away,
Hmm.
like, I'm just going to shelter in my home, or,
Hmm.
and I'm oversimplifying, whatever, but how does Sabbath lead us deeper into belonging? How does Sabbath lead us
Hmm.
deeper into
Hmm.
community and worship? Um,
Right.
which I think is
Right.
such a needed way forward. And because this is about the biggest table, my podcast is all about the biggest table. Like, where do you see the table, both in the church, as the Lord's table, but then in
Hmm.
our
Hmm.
homes? How can
Hmm.
the table be a curative action
Hmm.
for this extractive, exploitive economy world that we're so inundated with?
I mean, the table is sort of where we live all of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
The hospitality is such a theme throughout Scripture, and it has to be lived. It has to be experienced. You have to open your table up to others and welcome them into the space. And of course, at the Lord's table, we're being hosted by Jesus Himself, right? We're
Yeah.
accepting the invitation as His guests to come to the table. I think locating the table within the practice of Sabbath can also open up a lot of creative possibilities.
Hmm.
The Jewish practice, as I understand it, the table is central
Right.
on the Sabbath day, right? The feasts,
Yeah.
the song, the hospitality, and so on. It centers around this table fellowship. Um, Sabbath is this upending of Pharaoh's economy,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Pharaoh says, "You are valuable for what I can take out of you. You are valuable for how I can exploit you." And this was the people's experience for generation after generation after generation. And then here comes this God intervening on their behalf and giving the gift of Sabbath to say, no, actually, you're valuable because of who you are. And this world is
Hmm.
beautiful and valuable because I made it. And so I'm going to invite you into these rhythms of Sabbath rest that are weekly, that are yearly, that are every 7 years, that are every
Yeah.
50 years. I'm going to so weave it into your pace that you're constantly being reminded that all of creation is a gift. That however hard you work, at the end of the day, what you have, what you eat, the air you breathe is all a gift of my creation. And so I think we situate a table in that paradigm, right?
Right. Yeah.
Certainly it flattens a lot of stuff, right? It flattens a lot of those hierarchies. It
Hmm.
flattens who has the capacity to host and who has
Hmm.
the assumption of being guest. It upends all of those things if everything is gift, and it allows us to come around either the Lord's table. In our church, we always do potluck lunch after celebrating Holy Communion, so we kind of
Nice. Yeah.
feel that in some kinds of ways, or we open up our homes to each other. Within the economy of gift and grace, where we're
Hmm.
literally tasting and seeing together of God's really good gifts for us that manifest in the food that we're eating and who prepared that food and the love that was put into that mac and cheese that you brought
Yeah.
to the potluck, right? Um, in our case, as we get into the summer and the fall, sometimes there's leftover produce from the community garden, so there'll be boxes of collard greens or carrots or
Right.
radishes or whatever for people to bring
Yeah.
home with them. And so all of this for me starts to point to the God's logic of gift and grace, which holds all
Hmm.
of creation together. And we're better than a table to actually taste of that reality.
Right. No, I love that. That that when we see everything as gift and grace, you know, life becomes we have a leveling, um,
Yeah.
and so then too, but like the table, I'm just gonna say it because the table can still be a hierarchical space. Like
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
can invite people into my home on my terms, and feel good about myself.
That's right. That's
how
right.
do we, again, we're so inundated and live in this experience of hierarchy, of extraction, of exploitation. Like, how do we guard against that pressure and, enter the world as guests on behalf of others?
Yeah. I think that's actually a really important question because the question is also about power. It's,
Right.
who has the power to set the table, to choose the menu, to decide when things stop and start, and so on. So it's hierarchy and the power beneath that. One of the things I love about our church potlucks is that it happens in this. We meet in a school gymnasium.
Hmm.
There's no air conditioning. It gets very hot in the summertime. There's bees flying around in the fall. It's very unglamorous. But here's this gym, full of round tables and children and adults sitting around them. Incredibly racially diverse, delicious food, and we're all hosting together, and we're
Right.
all guests together. And there's something really special about that. It's one of the
Hmm.
things I most look forward to whenever it is that we're able to purchase a permanent facility. We've tried a couple times and it hasn't happened yet. But I get very excited about just the old school church basement, church kitchen,
Right.
where we're hosting meals like this. There are people in our church community who, maybe wouldn't feel comfortable inviting folks into their home for whatever reason.
Hmm.
Maybe it's too small. Maybe it's in a part of the city where they don't necessarily feel comfortable inviting everybody to come over, whether that's a good thing or not. But there's understandable reasons why not everybody feels as though they can be a host. And
Hmm.
so I know it's not a glamorous answer, but there's something special about a shared physical space that doesn't belong to any one person,
Hmm.
where the community, the worshiping community, gets to trade roles of playing host and playing guest. And for those of us who are used to being the host, who are used to having the power to make those decisions, something very important about being in those kinds of spaces where we didn't set the table. All we did was accept the invitation to
Hmm.
be at that table. I can say, as a white man, that has been one of the most formational things for me over the years, is to be in spaces where the only reason I'm here is because somebody invited me. I didn't set the
Hmm.
agenda. I don't know what the goals of this meeting are
Right.
necessarily, right? I didn't plan
Yeah.
it, but someone thought enough of me to ask me to be here, to be at this table with them in this
Hmm.
space. That does a really deep work on my on my own heart.
Wow.
It ends up being a really liberating thing as well too. I realize, oh, actually, I don't always have to play that role, and that feels pretty good actually, to just
Yeah,
get to be a guest sometimes.
for sure. No, I hear that. Yeah. Like, I think, often as church leaders, we're so used to being in charge that, like, to
Mhm,
receive the
mhm.
invitation um,
Yes,
can be liberating.
yes,
Um,
yes.
I'm been a pastor. I'm not a pastor currently, and so just to walk into a church space on a Sunday, not have any responsibility is there's something freeing about it. It's not a
Yes,
place I want to
yeah,
stay, but there's that it's
absolutely.
it's also doing a work in me. I've
Yeah.
realized. So I love that, of accepting the invitation, and being only at the table because someone invited me.
Mhm,
Um, and so, yeah, I think we often think, oh, I need to be a good neighbor and invite people into my home, but
mhm, mhm.
you know, how to go into the world as a guest and to accept the invitation of our neighbors to be in their home, or to accept
Yeah,
an invitation to be at a table that we may not otherwise belong. Not necessarily.
yeah,
The
yeah,
society
yeah,
may not want us at that table.
correct.
Um, so no, I think that's gorgeous. And so, like, you straddle this line of not swinging towards utopianism and not swinging
Mhm,
towards despair.
mhm, mhm,
How do you how have you done that for your life, and
mhm,
continue to do it when the world and much of the church would you could have just thrown up your hands?
mm,
um,
mm.
so for you, David, personally, like, how has this worked itself out?
Yeah, I I really do still think this is a incredibly beautiful world. I think we've made a terrible, terrible mess of it, more so than many of us in our kind of privileged insulation are willing to recognize. And yet, this is a beautiful, beautiful
Mm.
world. Um, which is just still evokes awe and wonder from me. And I mean the natural world. I also mean the human, world. These are not two separate things. They are the
Mm.
same. And I need to linger on that. I need to linger on the beauty of
Mm.
of this world, the goodness of this world. I need to linger on the stories that um, are quiet and so could be missed, could be overlooked, of people's faithfulness and love for one another and love for their places. Uh, it's necessary for us to know what we're up against. It's necessary to make these connections of what's wrong and our own sin and how that's woven itself into these systems. But at the end of the day, I'm compelled by beauty,
Mm.
and this is still a beautiful, beautiful world. Um, so that's probably the biggest thing that keeps me from despair. I feel like cynicism and despair have succumbed to the logic of uh, the Anthropocene, where everything is devalued, everything is commodified, and I don't want to live in that place.
Mm.
I want to live in an enchanted universe that still is full of wonder and awe and beauty, and I think it
Mm.
is. Um, but also, as you say, I don't want to succumb to the utopian instinct of thinking that we can make everything good and right. That's such a dangerous instinct. As soon as you lock your vision in place, you've got to start manipulating people
Mm.
in order to reach that vision. You've got to start manipulating creation itself in order. So I want to resist that as well. And instead try to live in this tension of telling the hard and the painful truth, but also never losing sight of just how beautiful God's world and God's creation is. And then the last thing I'd say about that, Andrew, is just it really is in the connection with people in a place that anchor me in all of that,
Yeah.
right? Because I can be having a terrible day, and then I'm with some people who've got some really great stories to tell about something
Mm.
happening in the neighborhood, something happening in the community. Someone can have a really terrible day, and I could have come back from a little birding expedition in our urban park and said, yes, and do you know what's migrating through right now? Do you know that the
Mm.
God who cares for those birds cares for us in this? So
Yeah.
so that location within an actual placed community ends up being a huge source of hope for me.
Wow. No, I love that. And I think after um, this week, and coming out of the presidential election and all of, it's easy to despair. And so I love that
Mhm.
admonition where to look for beauty, to still find the beauty and the enchantment. Um, whether it's bird watching, whether, for me, Friday I got to go hiking in Sedona with some friends, and you're
Yes.
just
Oh,
like,
yes.
okay,
Amazing.
like, yeah,
That's right. kind
yeah,
of kind of contextualizes things a little bit, right?
yeah. And so I think, yes, we need to mourn and grieve what is real and true, but also to still look for the beautiful, like
Yes.
to still have eyes to see um, what the beauty of our place, the beauty of our community,
That's right.
because
That's
it
right.
is there.
That's
Um,
right.
yeah. And so, listeners, I just encourage you to meditate on that, to live in that tension that David is inviting us into of grieving and mourning and telling the truth, but also still finding the beauty um, that is all around us because God hasn't forsaken this world.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
uh, wow. Um, it's a question I ask all of my guests. And so you've hinted at it, but it's always a great summary question. What's the story you want the church to tell?
Mm, mm. It's Athanasius who says that the entire universe is created through the second person of the Trinity, is created through Christ. And Athanasius says, and through his life and death and resurrection, the universe is recreated through Jesus. I want the story that we tell about what Jesus has done to be really, really big. That Jesus has recreated the universe. And we see evidence of evil resisting that. We see what we've done to this world. And there are witnesses who have lived through the worst of all of that and can still testify that Jesus has recreated the universe. And so I that's the story I want us to tell, that because Jesus has done this, we get to play our role. We get to reclaim that role of caretaking, that affectionate caretaking for our neighbors and for ourselves. We can allow ourselves to be cared for by our neighbors, by the places that we've been called to. I don't think we can overstate the power and the beauty of what it means that Jesus has recreated everything.
Wow. I love that. Like you're inviting us into this big story lived in a very small,
Yes, that's right.
contextualized space.
That's right.
Which is cool. Right. Like when you said big, I was like, like it caught me off guard just because of how much you've called us to live in a and pay attention in a right way of our localized space. But I think situating that localized story in the big story can only, usher us forward into something new.
That's right.
Well, David, thank you. But before we end, I have a few fun questions centered around food to end with. It's usually a 180, but it's also fun. So what's one food you refuse to eat?
This is embarrassing. I still can't eat tomatoes. I like them in any form except whole raw tomatoes, and we grow them, and our kids love them, and I try every summer and can't do it.
That's fair. I understand. I get it. I think another guest mentioned tomatoes too. I think it might have been Richard Beck, but so anyway, you're not alone. So
I was visiting this farm in Portland a year ago, and they had all these different tomatoes, and I'm just like feeling so terrible. Like they're like trying to get us to taste them, and finally they go like, and this one tastes like a peach. I'm like, all right, I'll try it. And with my imagination, I could get there, but I was like, no, it's still a tomato. I still can't do it.
Gotcha.
So bad.
That's fair. No, I understand. On the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Oh gosh, we have so much good food in the city of Chicago. One of the best things. So there's a sandwich that you can really only get in Chicago. It's called a jibarito, and it was invented by Puerto Ricans living in Chicago, and it's mashed plantains fried, and then that becomes the bread of the sandwich. And then you've got lettuce, mayo, sweet tomatoes, and then different meat options. I could answer a lot of different things to that question, but that's a super Chicago thing that if you ever visit Chicago, you've got to try a jibarito.
Jibarito. Okay. I've not heard. Wow. That's a new one for me.
Yeah.
That's cool. And then finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one more meal left to enjoy, what would it be? And so if David knew he had one last meal to enjoy, what might be on his table?
It'd probably be two different options. One would be like my birthday meal growing up was very simple. My mom would make baked beans, potato salad, and then my dad would grill hamburgers. And so that's one of my favorite comfort foods to this day.
Yeah.
Tomorrow I'm gonna make this Thomas Keller butternut squash soup because the squashes are in season right now here in Chicago, and it is so delicious. So I'm thinking about it because it's the fall, right? Like I love this soup in the fall. So if my last meal was in the fall, that might be what I would choose. Is that butternut squash soup? It's super delicious.
That's awesome. No, I appreciate it. Thank you, David. I love this conversation. I just really love your heart. The reality that you call us to embrace of the goodness and the pain and the, and so if people want to learn more about your work and what you're thinking, what you're up to, is there a place they can find you?
Yeah, my website is kind of has all the different links to social stuff and newsletter. It's DW Swanson, as in David Winston Swanson, dwswanson.com.
Awesome. Yep. And we'll make sure that's in the show notes. But yeah, please do follow David, find his work, read his books, Plundered and Rediscipling the White Church, I think, which came out right before COVID, which was very apropos, it helped me and some of my friends as we navigated that time. So thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your call to the church. David, you are a gift for us. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. This was a really fun conversation.
I'm glad. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.